Hi, and welcome to the Community Advocate podcast. Today, we're very fortunate to be joined by Krystian Seibert. As an Assistant Commissioner with the Productivity Commission, Krystian played a key role in the just-released report into philanthropy, Future Foundations for Giving. Described by Charities Minister Andrew Leigh as a once-in-a-generation review of philanthropic giving, the inquiry received more than 700 submissions, and Krystian travelled the length of the country, speaking to key sector stakeholders in more than 100 meetings. Krystian is about to begin a new role as Philanthropy Australia's Executive Director, Policy, Government Relations and Research. He's keen to share his own thoughts on the philanthropy report and the difference he hopes it will make in helping the federal government meet its commitment to double giving by 2030. Welcome, Krystian.
Great to be with you, Greg.
It's a pleasure to have you. Just straight off the bat, very general question, but how significant is this final report? Like, so there's a lot of water under the bridge. We can talk about it. It's taken a lot of hard work and effort to get here, but the final product from the Productivity Commission standpoint is how significant is what was handed over to the government and they've just released?
I think it really is significant, and I really do think it is a once-in-a-generation review, like it's being referred to by the Assistant Minister for Charities. If you look beyond Australia, there are very few examples of an inquiry that's so wide-ranging and comprehensive, focusing on philanthropy. And so I think it's quite significant in that regard, but also the breadth of what we looked at, the breadth of our recommendations, and also the time, effort, the commitment from the team to doing the analysis in terms of supporting where we landed. I think it is very significant.
The report contains numerous recommendations, depending on like with the key recommendations, and there's a lot of recommendations in the nature of that report. Which is the most urgent reform in your view? I know that's maybe a hard question to answer, but is there one that stands out? We can talk about the focus of the report, but is there one key reform that you thought needs to be enacted above all others?
Well, I think that the report presents the recommendations as a package, but it's pretty clear that DGR system reform of the deductible gift recipient system that determines which charities can receive tax-deductible donations really is the most significant proposal there. And I think it needs to be a priority because it's very clear that the system, it's broken and it needs a major overhaul, focusing on expanding access to charities that currently miss out and simplifying the system. This inquiry is not the first inquiry to recommend reform. The Productivity Commission recommended it back in 2010. The Not-for-Profit Sector Tax Concession Working Group recommended it in 2013. But 10 years later, we're still dealing with this broken system that needs to be fixed. And hopefully this will be the last inquiry to say that.
I know there's probably a lot of relief, the gratitude within the sector that DGR is being addressed, obviously. Like, so it has been a thing for a while. It should just articulated, so there'll probably be some happy people, hopefully, that'll be all the work that's been done to address that in the report.
And we did a really deep dive and extensive engagement and analysis. Like, the system was really run through the ringer, and we were informed by academic experts, stakeholders from across the charity sector to sort of inform and shape where we finally landed. But there is that finding that the system is poorly designed, overly complex, and has no coherent policy rationale, and it's not fit for purpose as a mechanism for determining which charities should be eligible to receive that indirect support from the government. I mean, we have a situation. We actually had a submission from an organisation which basically says that they can win the Nobel Peace Prize, but they can't get DGR status. So many grassroots and volunteer-run charities currently miss out. Advocacy charities miss out. There are so many holes and gaps in it. It really does need to be reformed. Yes,
that's one of those things. You're not going to get a lot of pushback for trying to look at this part of the ecosystem to reform it for the reasons that you'd said. What are the main, again, hard to encapsulate, but what are the main differences between the draft report and this final report? Are there major differences? I know the process you went through, you called for more submissions and you got quite a lot of submissions in relation to the draft report. Was there a lot of movement in between, or was it more tweaking? Or
yeah, well, and we really appreciated all the input and feedback we got and all the engagement we had in all our meetings. You said, like up to sort of or over 100 public hearings, in major cities and online. And yeah, there were changes from the draft to the final report. So in the discussion of the DGR system, we sort of expanded that discussion. We responded to a lot of the input and feedback and the points raised with us regarding some of the changes that some stakeholders didn't agree with. We didn't change the overall position between the draft and the final report, but we certainly engaged with what we were hearing from stakeholders. There was a lot more work done around the discussion of structured giving vehicles, private and public ancillary funds, which we recommended be renamed as public and private giving funds. And for example, there is a proposal for an inquiry by the Australian Law Reform Commission to look at ways to harmonise legislation across the states and territories in relation to charities, and also a recommendation around having an independent review to look at the progress towards achieving nationally consistent fundraising regulation, the fixed fundraising campaign, and also quite significant changes in terms of the recommendation made around a body to support partnerships and access to networks by Indigenous organisations and people, which we've provisionally called Indigenous Philanthropy Connections. And we really benefited from the perspectives and insights shared with us through our Indigenous stakeholder engagement strategy as well.
And so, yes, nothing so much was knocked out between the reports rather than refined. And as you say, listened to, in some certain areas that you just outlined, tweaking some of those, the original recommendations or the concepts, if you like. But there was nothing that you'd sort of bowled up in the draft report and, that was sort of hit for six by the time the final report came around.
Yeah, I think our main sort of change was around sort of in that discussion around, the body to support partnerships and access to networks in the context of Indigenous people and organisations, and how they work with philanthropy, how the philanthropic sector provides support. That section had quite a lot of change.
Yeah. As you did, which is why you liaise with people and ask. If you ask for people's opinions, they're going to give them to you. So as good as the sector,
and we listened. We really
listened,
and we really benefited and appreciated all the insights and perspectives shared with us.
Are you disappointed Charities Minister Andrew Leigh so quickly rejected the recommended changes to the tax setting around school building funds? I mean, they responded quickly as they would. We'll look at all the recommendations, but that one was pretty much hit out of the park right from the get-go.
Well,
did that surprise you? Or?
That's how the process works in terms of the Commission's an independent policy advisory body, and it makes recommendations, and then it's a matter for government whether it accepts them or not. And you go back through history, there's lots of Productivity Commission reports and lots of recommendations that get accepted and ones that don't, and it's totally the role of the government to make those decisions because they're held democratically accountable for them. So I totally understand that.
Why did you make that recommendation? That's now the government have expressed their view, but what was the people like yourselves path to making that recommendation?
Yeah. And we add a lot more detail to our discussion of that in Chapter 6 of the final report. And there are strong reasons for governments to support school education, including the provision of school infrastructure. The question was, is the DGR system, deductible donations, the right way for that support to be provided? Because there are trade-offs here. Like, one of the themes of the final report is that nothing is actually free. Tax concessions, tax incentives, that does come at a cost too. There are trade-offs, so we have to look at them really carefully to sort of think of the settings right. And we ultimately said that the DGR system is not the best way to provide this support. There are other ways to provide it through grants, matched giving, etc. And we actually added in a bit of a discussion of that in terms of alternatives in the final report. But our recommendations regarding school building funds, they were evidence-based. If you use donations to cover building costs, you can lower fees, and that's not what the DGR system should be about. And we did hear from a lot of stakeholders saying that, if this was implemented, then fees would have to go up, which is indicative that there is a substitution here, which is problematic. And the thing is, we're not actually the first to point out that there are some issues in the space. Charity tax law expert and advisor to the OECD, Professor Anna Connell of the University of Melbourne, has written about it, and the NFP Sector Tax Concession Working Group that I spoke about earlier, when they looked at tax concessions in the DGR system back in 2012 and 2013, they don't recommend anything specifically around school building funds. But they did point out that there are risks in the context of school education where donations could be used as a substitute for fees. And yeah, we did a lot of analysis there. We represented all the different views that have been shared with us, but ultimately our position was the same.
I think you've explained, yeah, it's government's right, and they do, it's what governments do. Were you surprised that they knocked it back? Or, like, as you said, you put your best foot forward, you do the research, you make the recommendation. It's up to government whether they accept it. Did it surprise you, or it did not surprise you? Or it was just,
well, I mean, I think that, the government had made some signals earlier this year. And yeah, like, as I said, I think it's really sort of, it's the way the system works that the government make the decisions, the commission provides advice, and it's all transparent. And I've seen the Assistant Minister do some media on Friday, sort of just explaining sort of some of their reasoning, and that's totally understandable.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So along with a series of recommendations in the report, it also contained a number of findings, including that administrative costs are not reflective of charities' performance in a very general sense. Does this acknowledge sector concerns about, sensitivity of overhead costs and that kind of thing? I mean, I know I'm being very general. I'm just sort of cherry picking some of these things out there, but it's one of the things that jumped out at me. When there were some very interesting findings in the report, along with recommendations, as observational, based on a lot of hard work. But yes, does that sort of tie in with sectors' concerns about overhead costs a little bit, or looking at?
Well, absolutely, and I think that the Commission is an economic research organisation that there's a lot of rigour to the work that it does, and a lot of smart people working there doing the analysis. And I think there is a lot of focus in general and a lot of debate around administration costs, overhead costs. Some people they think that they're an indicator of effectiveness or like a proxy of effectiveness, and I think having a finding which says that they're not an indicator of effectiveness, sure, there's something you can take into account. From the Productivity Commission, a finding like that is very powerful. And we also tried to, in the final report, elevate the work that is happening in this space. So there is the Reframe overhead sort of initiative where charities are coming together, working together to try and change the way they communicate with donors around administration costs and overhead. There's the pay what it takes work happening within the philanthropic sector in partnership with charities, and there'll be a focus on that at the Philanthropy Australia conference in Adelaide in a couple of weeks. So I think it was really sort of, coming from a position of, what's the evidence base, what's the sort of the analytical sort of perspective here, but really providing a very practical recommendation about this that hopefully will contribute to sort of the debate around this and shifting some of the narratives and attitudes.
Yeah, I'm sure some organisations or people reading that report would think exactly that. It'll be nice to solve the problem, but to actually have it called out in print in a report that, yeah, this is a thing. It's not, we're trying to, as you say, mention those campaigns that are running to highlight this issue, but it's more evidence to the fact that it's a big rock that a lot of organisations are trying to solve. What was the thinking behind the minimum distribution rate for ancillary funds? I know the context is laid out in the report, but the recommendation to adjust that percentage.
Well, I suppose the recommendation sets like a policy framework for the rate and says it should be set between 5% and 8%, and proposes a number of other things. I mean, the current rate for private ancillary funds, PAFs, is 5%. So it's up to the government sort of where it exactly sets it, but it more sort of provides a range based on, some very detailed analysis. But I suppose the reason we looked at this is that giving is growing in Australia. Less people are giving, but those who are giving more. And the growth in giving is being primarily driven by those on higher incomes. And what we're actually seeing over time too is that the proportion of deductible giving, as in donations which are tax deductible every year, a larger proportion of that is actually going into ancillary funds. So it's really important to look at the policy settings that apply to ancillary funds, because when you make a donation into an ancillary fund, there can be a sort of a gap between when the donation goes in and when money goes out to charities to benefit the community. So it's really important to ensure that the policy settings are right, balance the benefits from growing ancillary funds and the funding they provide to the community, with there being a steady flow of those funds to charities that actually do the work within the community.
And it's important to get that the percentage right. Like, it just needed to be looked at.
But also our recommendations around ancillary funds, including changing their name, also go to the fact that, this is another theme in the final report, that the quantity of giving matters, but also the quality of it, like how you actually practice giving. You can give a one-off grant, you can give, general operating support, multi-year funding, that sort of thing. And we also made a recommendation that ancillary funds should have to have a distribution strategy, which basically just sets out how they actually distribute funds to charities to benefit the community. We're not prescriptive about what that should be. It will be dependent on the particular ancillary fund and that sort of thing, but it's a prompt to think about actually, how much we're giving out, but also how we're doing it.
Some in the sector, you never make everyone happy all the time. You can't please everyone, like just in terms of issues and the rocks you're trying to solve. But some in the sector may feel the report doesn't go far enough, like either rejecting or not really considering reports such as reducing superannuation taxes for bequests, which I know was considered, and you explain why that's not part of the report. But things like living wills, inheritance taxes that were thrown up before the report are the kinds of things that some organisations would like to see included in the final. Why were some of those decisions made? Or would it be a sense that you can't include everything that you would like to? You've got to be pretty focused, I imagine. But something like, superannuation taxes and bequests. So what was the thinking behind
on superannuation, there is sort of, a discussion in chapter 8 of the final report, and there is sort of, a statement in principle that, making it simpler to provide excess superannuation upon death to charities, is a good thing, and there'd be merit in looking at that. But any changes to the sort of the mechanism with which you distribute excess superannuation upon death, it's called a binding death nomination. You have to be really careful about unintended consequences. You've got to make sure that you look at it holistically. So it's not that the report says that, no, it's all fine, don't do anything there. It didn't make a recommendation, but it did make those observations. In terms of, the taxes and that sort of thing, I think that goes back to a point I made earlier that, there are trade-offs. Like if you provide an additional tax incentive or concession, that costs the government money too, and then we can't do something else. Whether it's, reform the DGR system or fund services and charities directly. So there are trade-offs, and nothing is free, which is why we really looked over the various proposals quite closely, and there was a high threshold for proposing changes. But yeah, the general focus really of the report is making sure that the foundations for giving, hence the name of the report, are solid, are firm, so that giving can continue to grow into the future and benefit the community.
And that's an interesting way to put it, Tej. You just have the threshold that you had, yes, being pretty high. So that's an interesting way to approach it. That if some proposals don't get over that threshold in terms of the report, then that's why the report is in the form that it is, and also you can't include everything that people would like to see, especially in one hit, and incremental change.
And it's focusing on the foundations, making sure the foundations are solid and firm for the future. And another theme in the final report is that there is a role for government to do things. So only governments can change tax policy or regulation, but doubling giving isn't the sole responsibility of the government. It's the responsibility of all of us. And I say us because I am of the not-for-profit sector too. At Philanthropy Australia now, I'm chair of a mental health charity. So government's got a role to play, but philanthropy's got a role to play too. Charities have a role to play, and together, working in partnership, all contributing to building the future foundations for giving, I'm very confident we can double giving, if not go further.
Based on what is in the report and the some of the foundations that have been laid.
Yeah,
and these recommendations
then,
are taken forward, it will help do that.
Yeah, and also, philanthropic organisations, charities, they're the ones, like charities and their fundraisers are the ones who are engaging with donors to inspire them to give more. Financial advisors that are helping shape people's financial decisions, whether to set up a PAF or not, for example, they can all contribute to achieving the goal and going further. The Productivity Commission doesn't make recommendations to all of them. It makes recommendations to government. But achieving the goal and going beyond it is really about, everyone contributing, including government, and working in partnership. I maybe sort of like to use the analogy that I just bought a house recently. And one of the things I did, I got a building inspector to do an inspection and check the foundations. And if the foundations weren't solid, well, I would have focused on fixing them. Fortunately, I got a good report back. But you focus on fixing the foundations, and then, you focus on the kitchen, the bathroom, the fit out, that sort of thing.
Mm. I noticed that is a good way to look at it. And like I say, it is in the gives away the title of the report. The foundations is a word that's in there, so it's pretty integral to what you were trying to achieve. I know I did mean to ask too about workplace giving and just increasing transparency about some of the those metrics in that area. What was the thinking there? I mean, yes, it's about increased transparency, but in terms of how that will help hit the doubling philanthropy target.
Yeah. So the main recommendation around sort of increasing transparency is in relation to corporate giving, and there's a proposal there that that listed companies, so large companies, should have to publicly report on their giving annually. And I think that the benefits of that are that you then sort of get their boards thinking about something. When something has to be publicly reported, then boards think about it. But also there is evidence showing that in the case of corporate philanthropy, there can be peer company looks at its peer companies, sees what they're doing. So you could have this kind of a race to the top. But also it provides information for shareholders and other stakeholders within the community about their giving practices, which sort of fit in with their corporate social responsibility practices. So I think that's a really powerful recommendation that it sort of hasn't gotten too much attention, but I potentially think it could have quite a large impact, and I'm quite excited about it.
Oh, yes, I said workplace giving, but corporate giving. That's I understand the terminology. It should be saying corporate, not workplace giving, which is a different thing. And the only other thing I was just going to ask you, it's a general sense about regulatory power, like, strengthening the powers of giving more powers to the ACNC in terms of reporting and its regulatory role. That's obviously, perhaps not the sexiest thing, but a very important thing in the report. The way that that's touched on in different guises in the report, but to help strengthen this regime.
Absolutely, and although we weren't looking at the entirety of the ACNC regulatory framework that's been looked at before, we did look at it because regulation matters in terms of giving donors confidence to give. And we made a number of recommendations there. I mean, I think that one of the key ones there is that the ACNC is responsible for charities regulation, but actually there are lots of other regulators. There's regulators at the federal level, Australian government level, at the state and territory level. And there's a lot of cooperation and collaboration. It's quite informal, but the sort of key thrust of the final report was sort of developing sort of the architecture for this kind of like joint stewardship approach, where there's the ACNC, the state and territory regulators, there are attorneys generals that have responsibilities, making sure that it's more formalised, that cooperation, that collaboration, but also, like I mentioned earlier, ensuring that the work that started on fundraising regulation reform, it has sort of slowed, it seems, to make sure that it is delivered. And also importantly, more broadly in the context of regulation, that when changes are made that in general to regulation, not just in the case of charity regulation, that the impacts and effects on volunteers are properly considered, because we found quite a bit of evidence that that's not been the case in the past.
Mm-hmm. No, and as you said, that national piece on the fundraising, it has been a bit, so it's been called out as well. So it'd be nice if it actually just going to keep pushing for that incremental change. How do you think the final report will be viewed by the sector? I mean, as I said, you are a part of the sector, but do you think overall, and so far, the reaction has been positive? I mean, that will probably keep coming the next days and weeks, and it depends on what the government does with the report. But do you think it's been well received and will be well received?
Well, yeah, I'm getting lots of good feedback. I think it always takes a little bit of time to process, what's being proposed. I think the thing is that there's no sort of silver bullet there, and like I said earlier, there's a role for government, and there's recommendations around policy change and some significant reform to the DGR system. And then there's a package of different proposals and recommendations. And I think that overall it's a good package. It's a solid package focused on the foundations for giving. And also, I think that, say, the DGR system reform, one particular thing about the DGR system right now is that a lot of the charities that miss out are those really small volunteer-run grassroots charities like community gardens, and they appeared before us at the hearings to give evidence. Neighbourhood houses, for example, often miss out on DGR status. And the thing about all these organisations is that they're those organisations right in there in the community building social capital. And I think if you enable them to access DGR status, I reckon that sort of bottom-up work that they do, the connection they have with people in the community, could really help drive sort of a lot of that kind of giving at a real grassroots community level, that smaller scale giving, which we're seeing drop off over time. Like I said earlier, sort of the amount that people are giving is sort of going up, but the participation overall is going down. And those groups too are the ones that don't have, they don't have sort of powerful interest groups sort of representing them, walking the halls of Parliament, but they do such great work in our community. And the DGR system, it just doesn't meet their needs at the moment. And if you reform it to expand access, simplify it, I think there'd be real benefits for those grassroots organisations in the communities across Australia.
Thank you. That was excellent. Was there anything else you'd like to add on the main point?
Yeah. Other than just, once again, thank everybody that, contributed to the process, whether it's making a submission, a brief comment, meeting with us, giving evidence at a hearing, and all the people who've provided me feedback since it's been released, and really just acknowledge my colleagues as well on the inquiry. So the Deputy Chair of the Productivity Commission, Alex Robson, and then Commissioner Julie Abramson, and the staff team who really worked really hard to, deliver this significant undertaking. And also to say that, if people, once they get around to reading it, very happy for them to reach out and get in touch with me. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter and elsewhere. I'm always very happy to talk about it.
Oh, excellent. So the report's not over when you hand it over. Like you said, it's good to see that you've put yourself on the hook for it, keep the discussion going. Thanks for your time and your insights, Krystian. Much appreciated. It's a pleasure talking to you. We'll be watching Canberra closely to see how they respond to this very significant report. Join us again next time for the Community Advocate podcast.